Ms. Minkara, first of all, welcome to Chisinau, and thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion with you.
Of course, Eugenia, it's wonderful to be with you today.
I know that you are in a 2-day visit in Moldova. You met officials, civil society representatives, yes? From what you were able to find out, how do you appreciate their efforts to support the people with disabilities?
Well, exactly. So we've been here for 2 days. We arrived Wednesday evening and we've been Thursday, Friday doing meetings, as you said, with civil society, international partners, and also government entities from the Ministry of Labor and Security and the Ministry of Health. And it's been amazing just to see the wide range of efforts and the political will when it comes to really advancing the rights of persons with disabilities. And our visit is for a dual purpose. It's for both to really support in any way with the Moldovan government on protecting the rights of persons with disabilities as a country, but then also we've been super grateful for Moldova and its support to refugees that have come from Ukraine and how welcoming Moldova has been, and how can we support on the refugee with disability level as well.
Maybe you did some recommendation to Moldovan authorities.
So it's, there's a few different things that we're exploring, conversations around deinstitutionalization, and there's been a lot of amazing efforts on really moving from institutionalization to supportive living. And we actually met today. We went to an outside town and we visited 2 support living centers that the local government has, implemented with the support of Keystones. So that's and there's still some work to be done across the country, but there's a lot of efforts on that front. And the Moldovan government is hoping that by 2026, 50%, there's a 50% reduction of deinstitutionalization. So that's a lot. That's amazing on that front. Also with employment of persons with disability, there's a lot of political will on how do we make sure that society at large sees the value in the inclusion of persons with disabilities. It's not a charity. It's not just the right thing to do, but it actually brings value to companies and employers and society at large. So that's another thing that we're exploring as well.
What are the good practices from USA you think that can be implemented here in Moldova?
Well, so here's my perspective always is that you need to approach it from two levels, right? On one level is the laws and legislations and policies, right? And as a person with a disability who was born and raised in the U.S., I personally benefited from the legislation, the ADA, for instance, the American Disability Act. That in itself gave me the right to go to school, in mainstream school, to have a job, to live a life fully, right? That in itself is an amazing. But on the other hand, another parallel approach that needs to be targeted is this value-based narrative. The inclusion of persons with disability is not just the right thing to do, it brings value. And Accenture came out with a report a few years ago showcasing that companies that hire persons with disability actually helps the profit margins and the bottom line for the company. It increases it. So when companies see that and truly embrace that value-based narrative, then themselves they're going to say, I want to employ. I want to benefit from their contribution. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that front, if that makes sense.
Yes, of course. As a person with vision impairment, what are some differences in traveling around Washington, D.C. versus in traveling in Chisinau?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's commonalities and differences. I would just say, in traveling in DC with, public transportation and accessible roads and crosswalks and, just a wide range of issues, it really helps a person with a disability become more independent, right? To be able to access their life fully across the board. And I think that's really important. I think one thing that's still common across the globe, it's still the subtle, or it could be subtle or it could be in your face, that narrative towards disability. Anywhere in the world when I travel and I ask a person, what comes to your mind when you see a person with a disability? And so 90%, I'm just bringing out a number, but majority would say, well, I feel bad for them. They're struggling, they're suffering. Or we say the other narrative, the inspiration porn. Oh my God, they're amazing. we haven't yet come on a global level to this narrative that persons with disabilities are like anyone else. We expect them to be out and about. We expect them to be going to school, having jobs, having families, just living a life fully. That has not yet become an expectation across the board. So that's why we've been focusing. One of our main priorities in our office is to focus on disrupting the narrative.
So how can Moldova promote this narrative of inclusion, but in a positive way, in a constructive manner?
That's a really good question. I think there's a few different ways. One, I always say for the disability community to really, and allies to the disability community, engage the media, engage social media more, engage the entertainment world. When you're developing TV shows or the movies, whatever it is, when news is talking about disability, make sure it's the value-based narrative. That's really important. When you have a TV show that's being created, let's make sure characters with disabilities are normalized and not seen as like, oh my God, poor this person, became disabled, right? That's one way. Second is, how do we really showcase successful examples of persons with disabilities in our society? And there are in Moldova that are leaders, and that they can showcase kind of an example for others and empower others to really move towards that example. And then third, I always say, nothing about us without us, but I also say nothing without us. What I mean by that is that let's get society at large to actually always be asking the question, are persons with disabilities at the table? Ask that question. I mean, this is really important. And if they're not at the table, why not? And if they are at the table, are their voices heard? So there's so many different layers to this, but we need to be breaking out of the echo chamber. We tend to talk to each other who agree, right? Mm. That's not really changing the narrative outside of that circle. And that's what we need to do.
So beyond what the authorities should do, media should do, what could do every person in Moldova to improve the situation of people with disabilities?
I think first, this is broader than just disability. I always say, we as humans, when we meet people for the first time, we do size each other up, right? We label and we have assumptions. And I think the more that we can understand our own assumptions towards other, the more that we can try to delay our assumptions and have one assumption that this person has something beautiful to contribute, the more that we're going to create a society and a space that allows people to bring more of their value forward. And on a disability perspective, again, imagine each individual, they approach a person with a disability through that value-based lens. It makes a huge difference. For me personally, right? If my entire life I've been hearing the word, I feel bad for you, you're less than, you're incapable, etc., I'm going to believe that. I'm not going to have the strength to see my potential. The reason why I'm here is because I had amazing parents and family that believed in me, that saw me, that allowed me to tap into my potential. So this is why I say for each individual, we can really create an empowering space for others, ourselves and others. But it's the first step to understand ourselves and how we see one another.
I know that you visited a refugee placement center here in Moldova. What were your impressions on conditions there, and how adapted are the spaces for people with disability? Or maybe there are something else to do to make them feel more comfortable?
I mean, first of all, I go back to this point saying how amazing the Moldovan community has been to the refugees coming through, and also refugees with disabilities. And the center that we visited, they have, if I remember the correct number, 10. I'm not sure. I don't want to say a number that I don't remember. But anyways, they have refugees with disabilities, and they've taken them in, and you can feel the warmth, and you can feel how much that the community wants to support. There's always, they mentioned some kind of technical support that they need from beds to accessible bathrooms. But for me, a lot, always something that we always also encourage beyond this is how do we move towards, supportive living systems and that kind of stuff. But it's just been amazing seeing the Moldovan community be so supportive and welcoming.
Well, generally speaking, how has the war in Ukraine changed the lives of people with disabilities?
So, one of actually our priorities that we've listed as our office is to focus on advancing the rights of persons with disabilities during moments of crisis, because during moments of crisis, a lot of times persons with disabilities are left behind. Not intentionally, right? But because we as persons with disabilities, we have innate access barriers to the system. We are sometimes not able to access then evacuation buses, right? Information that's coming to us. Someone who is hard of hearing cannot hear, like if there's a bombing nearby, right? So many different things that we cannot access, and what that results in is us not being able to then be seen and heard and brought forward. So, and from the initial moments of the Ukraine crisis, we actually held a meeting with local individuals from Ukraine, individuals with disabilities and organizations, and we, from that point on, kind of hearing what their challenges are, right? And how can we make sure that we're hearing those challenges and bring them forward in different ways. And now we've been hosting bi-weekly calls with the international community on Ukraine and crisis and disability. It's an ongoing effort. It's not an easy thing, but what it takes is, to be honest, I always say when you have persons with disabilities at the table during pre-crisis planning, a lot of these things can be mitigated, right? Not everything, but a lot. You need that voices heard from the beginning. And then you also want to take it a step further, and you want to also make sure that you're seeing those voices from a value-based perspective. So if you think about it, if they're creating accessible evacuation buses, who else benefits? Parents with strollers, right? So accessible solutions, everyone benefits. And I think that's what we need to be looking at it. Another point as well, as hopefully we move forward and hopefully Ukraine goes to a point of rebuilding Ukraine, right? How do we see this as an opportunity to rebuild Ukraine in an accessible way? How do we make sure that this is an opportunity in the future, right? And how do we make sure persons with disabilities' voices are part of that process?
You were appointed to this position by President Biden last October. It's a very difficult period, marked by COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and this devastating war in Ukraine. So how do all these challenges affect people with disabilities? And what actions does the United States propose to advance their rights?
That's a good question. You mentioned climate change, COVID, Ukraine, you have Ethiopia, Afghanistan, everywhere. And again, crisis is the common thread here. And beyond that as well, in places with no crisis, there's other focus. So we actually have 4 main priorities that we're honing in on. One is fostering accountability and building capacity. How do we support countries and governments to really build their capacity through technical expertise in certain disability policy issues and implementation? We have over 50 years of experience here in the US of disability legislations and also implementation, a lot of learning lessons, a lot of examples of how we've been moving forward, and that's something that we provide as technical expertise to help build capacity. Also, we focus a lot on promoting disability inclusive democracy. When you're thinking about building a democracy or focusing on democracy, let's make sure disability are part of that process. It's not enough for persons with disabilities to access voting. How to make sure persons with disabilities are running for political office. Therefore, they are able to politically participate. They're part of the design of policies and implementation of policies. They're part of the decision making. They're part of the local budget planning. Their voices are heard across the democracy of the country that we're in, right? And, so there's a lot of different layers we're looking at, and then we're also looking at narrative change, disrupting the narrative. So it's not a switch of a button. I will say if disability inclusion work was easy, it would have been done, right? It's not easy. Also, it's not technical. It's adaptive work. It's cultural shift work. It's both individual and systemic work. It's short-term and long-term approach. There's a lot of, but ultimately I say the more that we just have these conversations, the more that we break down barriers, the more that we break down assumptions, the more that we're gonna move forward. But ultimately, we need to get society to really believe that inclusion of persons with disability brings value to everyone. And I'll end with a very simple example. I was a math major in college, and I used to have my friends come up to me and they're like, Sara, what classes are you taking next semester? And I'd be like, why? They're like, well, whenever you're in the class, the professor becomes a better teacher. Like, oh. And it's because he or she have to explain things better and articulate things better because I can't see what's on the board. Who's benefiting? Everyone is benefiting. Why don't we look at inclusion from that lens? And that's what we're trying to promote.